And continuing on the theme of the Christchurch earthquake from a Canadian perspective is our final speaker of the evening, Ron Dickinson from Canada. Ron has worked as a building inspector, chief building official, and director of development service for more than 25 years. Prior to his experience in Christchurch, New Zealand, his main work has been in villages of 250 people in mid-sized cities in the province of British Columbia, Canada. As a building official, Ron is certified to review buildings of all sizes and all types of occupancy throughout Canada. He has also been involved in the approval of design and construction of municipal services infrastructure. Currently, Mr. Dickinson is serving as the chair of the Alliance of the Canadian Building Officials Association. Ron was the past president of the Building Officials Association of British Columbia and past president of the British Columbia and the Yukon chapter of ICC. Please help me welcome Ron to round up this Christchurch theme.
Thanks. Well, those of us that managed to stay here and stick it out, but being the last guy, I don't think there's one thing that I was going to say that somebody hasn't already said. So, having said that, what I really wanted to bring to the forum and to everybody that I've met since I came back is I was there 3 years later, and most of the conversations we've had today are about planning for an earthquake, planning for the recovery of the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, and thinking about these kinds of things. And I had been involved in planning for emergencies, earthquakes. I lived in Vancouver, which is the north end of the San Andreas Fault. There's 2 million people live on the San Andreas Fault up there, along with the 10 million that live on it down here and so on. And so I lived in it, and I'd planned for emergencies, and fortunately for me, never actually had one. So when this opportunity came up, the employers, the councils in Christchurch were looking for building officials, and they came to Canada, and they actually spoke to Lynn Balfour, who's sitting right here, and asked if there was some way that they could express their needs, and they did. And so we ended up with about 25 Canadians down there in Christchurch doing this. I happened to be the first one. So I got there, and as you can see from this first slide, the two pictures up there are probably about, they could have been a minute apart, because that's how fast it happened. It was 45 seconds from that beautiful green scene to the dusty, smoky rubble in the downtown core. And that changed everybody's life in Christchurch, but everybody that had a relation with the people in Christchurch as well, forever. And it was a shock. And so I dropped in there with my wife. We just, moved there for 6 months to do this work, and couldn't believe the devastation. Somebody just mentioned that it was like somebody dropped a bomb on the Central Business District, and that was the first feeling I had. I hadn't seen anything like that since I'd seen pictures of Europe after the war or Sarajevo after the war. That was the kind of thing, and most of us that got there had the same sort of feelings. Now, this next slide talks about the number of things that have to be done, but the two photos are pictures of the streets 3 years later. They still look like that. There's rubble on the side of the right side of the road. The buildings are still standing, and all those buildings need to be knocked down. And they just hadn't got to it yet. And you saw a bunch of pictures of how they knocked the buildings down. When we approached the downtown core from the airport in a car, I said to the fellow that was driving, who was a building inspector, I said, "Wow, look at all the cranes. It looks like things are starting to happen." He said, "Oh, no, those aren't nothing to do with starting to happen. Those cranes are knocking things down. We haven't even got to the starting to happen thing yet." So we talked about the loss of lives. The houses, in the next slide here, there's 180,000 houses in Christchurch. And I can't believe you did all that, those inspections, but 180,000. There was 100,000 of them that need repairs. 10,000 needed to be knocked down. And 3 years later, when I got there, they needed to build 17,000 new houses that year to cover the ones that were knocked down and the demand for people, because people were still living there. They were still, the city had a growth plan, and they needed all these houses built. And so the pressures were coming from every direction on the construction industry, and they were looking all over the world for anybody that could do anything to do with construction. There was still buildings to be knocked down, and you saw this building crumbling earlier, the one on the bottom right. That was the old police station. It was a 20-story building, and it didn't fail during the earthquake, and neither did most of the other buildings. It was two critical failures, but in all those houses, nobody died. There were some serious injuries, and so people's lives were never the same, but nobody died in their homes. So that's speaks to the building code, and that's what we were talking about. How good is the building code? It is good, but most of those houses couldn't be lived in afterwards because the building code doesn't set out to achieve that. It just, you need to be able to get out. So this police building, just as an aside, my office that I worked in was right beside that building for the whole 6 months, and it couldn't be used because it was weakened. So we all go to work in the morning, and we get in the office and say, well, if we have a shaker today, like, how long is it going to last, right? And now you can see it crumbling. It covered a whole city block when it went down. So if it had to come down when we were in our office, it would have been history. And these street scenes, again, are like 3 years after the earthquake. So you can see the turmoil and mess that the city's in. When you're trying to get around, you have maybe a Garmin, or you're trying to figure out how to get somewhere, and you go and the road's closed. Oh, damn. So you go somewhere else and you get around, and you finally get there, and you go to come back. Well, the road you came on to get up is now closed, and the one that was closed is open. It's just complete turmoil for a lifetime, it seems like. Like 3 years later, that's what it was like. The cars, most of them don't have hubcaps because they all fall off because the roads are so messy. They're all bouncing and banging around and wearing out tires, and nobody wants to buy a new car because it's going to turn into junk. It's just an entire lifestyle that is hard to imagine. And another little moment that would happen, there was a lot of quakes, aftershocks and things. I think I might have a slide about that. Just a second. Anyway, so let's just deal with this. Nick mentioned earlier there's 400,000 tons of silt from liquefaction. And there was 2 liquefaction events, one in September and one in February. And between September and February, they'd cleaned up hundreds of thousands of tons of liquefaction out of their yards and out of their basements and out of their kitchens and out of their malls and everything else. And then, bang, a few months later, they have this other earthquake, and up comes the liquefaction again. They got to haul all that away. Now, it sounds like a huge task, and it was. And there was people out in the street with shovels and wheelbarrows and helping their neighbors and just dealing with it. But when it happened the second time, it completely demoralized people. Because they finally got their gardens back or their house back or their driveway or whatever it was, and all of a sudden, poof, it's all over again. And those kinds of demoralizing events were just unbelievable. The other thing that needs to be considered is there was 3,000 buildings. There was 1,200 still to knock down, 3,000 total. That's a lot of rubble. 10,000 houses is a lot of rubble. Where do you put it? The dump isn't going to have, or the landfill isn't going to have enough room for it. So they had to build a new landfill, basically. Just designate a chunk of land somewhere in Christchurch and put it all in there, and don't worry about it. We're not, asbestos? Yeah, maybe there's asbestos, and there's gyprock, and there's every other darn thing in it. But the real unusual piece of this landfill thing that just blew me away is some of the building waste may still contain human remains. And they had to have a special site for that. If they thought it may contain it, they had to take it away and put it in the forensic landfill. And that'll just be, we'll get to it someday if we need to, right? So just things that, like, who plans for that? Who plans for a landfill to put a city in? The whole downtown core had to go into this this landfill. Then the construction, the rebuild on the next one. it's starting. On the left, you'll see that what was called the Container Mall. And in the CBD, there was one business, one building down in the Central Business District that didn't fail. And it was able to run, as soon as it could get power and water, it was running. All the rest were not. So what the city did is they took a lease out on about 2 or 3 blocks of land that had formerly been occupied by businesses and buildings, and they leased it for 3 years from all the landowners, and then they had control over it, and they cleared it up right away, and they built a container mall. And it was, it was really interesting. They had all sorts of different ways of setting them up, 2 stories, 3 stories, cantilevers, but they were all these shipping containers, and they had coffee shops and sports stores and restaurants and curio shops, everything. And they put it all around, all around this one big business that hadn't failed. The building was still in there. It was a department store. And if they hadn't done all this, the department store probably wouldn't have survived, because this pulled the people in into the center of the city to do their shopping and stuff. And it was a lively little spot, and it was right near the strip that we were just talking about that was the sort of entertainment area, as near where that had been. So it was a good idea. It was the government sort of got going and made something happen in the downtown core. There was a really slow, they had an analysis done, and one of the reasons they came looking for building inspectors was that they analyzed the redevelopment curve, and it was a very steep curve. Out about 2 years, it started to steepen and leveled back out 5 years later. But that didn't happen. And it didn't happen because for 2 big reasons. One is financing. The finance companies, banks and wherever, would withhold financing after every magnitude 6 tremor. And they'd hold it off for 3 months. So all these businesses that wanted to get going, they really couldn't depend on the financing. So they didn't get started. So hence there's holes in the ground. They started knocking things down. And I don't think for the first 4 months that I was in Christchurch, I went downtown once, and my office was right down there. We lived near there. I don't think I went downtown once when there wasn't a hammer banging away on concrete, on a big, huge tracked hole with a hammer on it, just pounding. And truckload after truckload going out. But they didn't start building because of this financing thing. And the other thing, like most of these big buildings that are going up in there are probably, that one's a private one, but what the city and the national government did was they started to put anchor projects in, and that's really started to make things move in the downtown core. And the intensity of the tremors has diminished a lot. I think it was 11,000 tremors between September 2010 and today that they've had in there. And when we were there, we had 3 or 4. The biggest one was about a 4. And this is 3 years later. And every time there's a tremor, everybody in the city that was there during the earthquake gets the same adrenaline hit, because they don't know if this is the earthquake, the big one, or just a tremor. So they go up and they go down. And the next day or 2 after that, at work, at shopping, wherever you go, your friends, all they're talking about is the stories of the earthquake. So this whole thing just rehappens. It happens over and over again. The next slide is about the roads. There's 1,000 kilometers of the road network is damaged. That's 50% of it. So if you take 50%, that's a city of 350,000 people roughly. And yeah, I mean, that's a big place. You could sort of take that and say, okay, it could happen in the city of 2 million. You think 50% of the roads in your city are gone. Like, imagine how difficult it is to live in that area. And 500 kilometers of water, the storm sewer system. There was, I don't know how many houses it was, but there was a huge area that sunk. It's down by the ocean, and it had a dike around it to protect it from the high tides. And it sunk, and it went down 1.5 meters. But that's not a house. That's the whole street, all the houses, the street lights, everything went down. So this whole community went down 1.5 meters. It was still relatively unscathed as far as being able to be used, But now it's subject to flooding. The stormwater system doesn't work. The sewer system, there's pumps all over. I've forgotten the number. There's thousands of pumps in that city right now, still pumping sewage and stormwater because, of course, all the drainage is either damaged or out of alignment, out of grade. This is a huge number, this next one. $3 billion allocated for sewer and water, and it's nowhere near enough. If you can imagine, like these are huge numbers, and where does that money come from? It comes from the national economy, it comes from the city, it comes from ongoing taxes, it comes from the city liquidating things. I heard at one point they were thinking about selling the airport. It's a huge chunk of change to help them finance this thing. But these numbers are huge. I talked to an insurance expert in my community in Vancouver, up on the San Andreas Fault, 2 million people there. He said there's $97 billion worth of infrastructure that's not insured in that area, in that greater Vancouver area. So there's like about 15, 20 municipalities in there. So these numbers are just staggering. And where do you find that money? It's going to hurt the whole economy for decades. You can just see this hole in the ground here is all the shoring and everything, because they had to get down to repair some pipes, and it's just, you can't, a normal process, if they had a problem with that pipe, you dig up half a mile of street, you get a huge hole, you'd close it off, and you'd deal with it. But they can't, because they got to go in quick, fix it, and get out, because there's another place that needs to be fixed. So they're not even started to think about renewing. They're just fixing. And again, 3 years later. There was some numbers thrown around about how many people left, and I know there was lots that left. I got some numbers off of a couple of websites down there. They're not exactly the same, but the point is thousands of people left Christchurch, and they're not coming back. And one family, I knew the lady and one of her kids, and I never did meet her husband and her other daughter, because the husband and the daughter couldn't stand to live in Christchurch anymore, and they moved to Australia, and she and her other child wanted to stay. So what a fracture, like it's hard to conceive of that kind of a lifestyle for everybody. They did a survey. It wasn't like when I was there, it was just before, I guess, so like 2 or 2.5 years in. And they said 80% of the people's lives have changed significantly. So like 340,000 people, 80% is a big number. That's a lot of people that will never be never be the same again. And so that whole city will never be the same. It'll never be what it was. And that's a hard thing for people to adjust to, too. And so I had a few other thoughts, but checking the clock and all, I think maybe we've said enough for today. But that's my snapshot. And that was the real message I wanted to bring to people to think about. Like when you're planning, if you are involved in emergency planning of any sort, don't forget about the social and the ongoing strife that the community is going to go through. It was a shock to me, and it was a shock to many of us that dropped in on it, and I can't imagine what it's like to actually still be living it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron, for, again, re-emphasizing the Christchurch scenario and all the outcomes of it.